Hello again, and welcome back to the Ivy Growth Project. In this section, we're going to look at actually growing our ivy up something a little bit more interesting than a cube. And as you can see here, we have this, what I'm calling a ruins scene. And I've sort of sculpted this and sort of bashed it together using sort of different components. We've got this nice window, sort of church window, which we're going to grow our ivy up. Now, it doesn't. If you're following along, it doesn't have to be exactly the same asset, but the principles that we're going to go through here will actually apply to any scene that you want to grow your ivy up. The main thing is that we need to prep this scene, because currently, if I change this display to a one with lines in, so we go Gurad with lines, you can see here. I mean, the base, which is just decorative, really. That's a lathe, so that's not too much of a problem. But if we look here, the poly count on here is quite high, and the topology is pretty messy. Well, it's messy in perhaps a good way. It's quite consistent in its polygon sizes. I've actually poly reduced some original sculpts, but the one problem that we're going to have is that when our ivy starts to grow up this, it's going to grow around separate entities, so separate segments like this. You can see that's actually separate from the cement that surrounds it. And if you go inside here, you can see it's just full of interfaces and places where the ivy will want to grow through. So the first thing we need to do is actually combine everything into one mesh. And we can do that using the OpenVDB meshing or any kind of volume workflow. And the display is currently, because this actually has I've got some cycles materials on this already. So we're seeing the viewport as white because I'm using noises as my kind of procedural input. I like to sometimes turn off those textures. So if you go to your options in your viewport and you hit textures, that's NQ, I've made the shortcut. And you can see here, it's very multicolored. I sort of randomly colored them as I went along just to be able to see clearly which bits are separate components. I think that does the job. What we want to do is we want to combine all of this into one solid volume, and then we probably want to poly reduce it, because the lower the poly count, the quicker the lighter it is on the processing for moving, thousands of particles over. Instead of millions of polygons, we can go into the tens of thousands of polygons, and it's a big jump in speed. So, okay, first things, let's add a xpOpenVDBMesher. And that's what we have here. And we're going to look, we can collapse the mesh options. We might come back to that when we use mesh adaptivity. Threading options, don't need to worry about that too much. And we just want to be able to access sources, point radius. Actually, point radius isn't necessary at the moment because we're going to be dealing with surfaces and not the points. The voxel size, we will play with that once we've added some things. So let's take a look at our ruins hierarchy up here, and we can see here I've got these elements in separate sections. We've got the window, we've got the wall, and the wall is made up of individual stones. So we can actually see here we've got the wall stones, there's masonry cement, and what have we got here? We've got these sort of separate window masonry parts that are from another window that just happened to fall in front of this one, and some other stones in there. So we can see there's a bunch of separate elements. Let me undo those steps. And there we go. That's why you always save incremental as well, just in case something happened and you end up with the wrong parts. So first, let's just put the window in here. So we can actually drag in whole hierarchies. So I could drag in the whole ruins, but I actually want to exclude, or at least I want to leave that part out to start with. So the base, basically. I'm going to add the window first. So add the window in, give it a second. And you got to remember it's got to process over a bunch of polygons. So it'll take a second and then it'll show it to us in the viewport. If any of these operations take too long in this situation, I'll skip over them, and I'll let you know if I have to. There we go. That was pretty quick. Now, this is a bit low res at the moment, but we don't really need to match the resolution of the underlying stuff. So if we look here, if I go into a wireframe view, and actually if I right click this and make the ruins. I'm going to add a display tag to our ruins. This is just a useful workflow thing. And I can set this to a wireframe mode. And we're going to do wireframe. And I'm going to turn on backface culling so it's not as dense. And then if I go back to quick shading or garage shading, you can see here that gives us a good idea of how our volume is following this topology, or sort of shape, I should say. Okay, so currently that's a little bit too low res. I think if we go to 2, we should be able to see it looking a lot more sort of accurate to the shape. Takes a second. There we go. And the question is, are we going to worry too much about the smallest parts here? I don't think so. I think as long as we've got places for the ivy to kind of wrap around and go through, that's not going to be a problem. If I go to a NB and look at the wireframe, that's quite low res, so that's going to be nice and efficient. And again, we're going to reduce that down a step further as well using a poly reduction workflow. Awesome. Okay, so what have we got next? Let's have a look here. We've got this wall, which is full of separate stones and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to deactivate the window so I can just work on the wall. Now that we've got our base sort of resolution set. And I'm going to actually drop the wall in. And we'll see something interesting happen. I'll come back after it's processed, but because we're dealing with millions of polygons here. In fact, if I turn off this OpenVDBMesher and I hit Control-I or Command-I, we can actually see how many points and polygons we have in our scene. So that's including the leaves that we have in our ivy growth system, but that's 1.3 million polygons, essentially, which is quite a lot to do any processing over. So it's best, to in terms of expectations of what to expect, when it has to process over this many points, the meshing operations can be a little slow, but worth it in the long run. So you're spending a bit of time now to save a lot later on. Okay, so let me turn the OpenVDBMesher back on, and I'm going to drop this in. Now this will do something. So the OpenVDBMesher tries to estimate what type of geometry is being added, and obviously this is a null. So what it tends to do, it tends to look down for its first child and then will apply this type of meshing depending on what that is. Now we've got another null here, so what's it going to do? So I'm going to drop that in there. I'm going to let it process. There we go. That was quite quick. And you can see it's not conforming to the shape. So if I go into wireframe mode, so I've got it at NG, you can see it's weirdly offset. So it's kind of like a balloon or like a bubble all the way around our geometry. And what's happening here is it's using the points instead of the surface as the source for our volume. So if I click on in fact, I could demonstrate this by changing the point radius here. So if I change it to say 4, this bubble, its radius around those points reduces and you see it comes tighter. Now we could go all the way until it ends up touching the edges, but the problem with that would be, if we zoom in here, we can actually see it has an interior bubble. So if we zoom in here, actually if I make it, you can see we've actually got loads of extra geometry we actually don't want. And that's no good. So we're just going to deal with the surface. So all we have to do is click on the source. Let's collapse some of these things so I can scroll down a bit quicker. And it's currently in mesh mode points. It's looking at the object hierarchy. That's absolutely fine. But we want to change this from points to surface. Let it process. Remember, it's got to find the surface, so that's an operation in itself. And might take a little longer, as you can see. But I don't think it's going to take so long that I'll have to pause the video. Like I said, with all this interior geometry here, we're actually probably going to have to create some extra geometry in our ruins model to actually cull out some of that, because even though this is undesirable here, we actually want that to be culled out elsewhere where there's gaps in the meshes and stuff like that. So there we go. That's actually made our wall nice. And if I go back to a shaded mode, we can hide our ruin. There you go. That's now meshed that. Now, so we can actually see the difference here. So if I zoom in to this interior, you can see we can actually see all the way through to the other side here. And then all the way back up. We could actually go up. Once we add the window in, we'll actually be able to see that geometry as well. The difference being that if I turn this wall geometry, or just show this wall geometry back on. Oh, I think I just modified it. So it's actually going to remesh it because I've modified the hierarchy. That's something to watch out for as well. If you make changes to the hierarchy, it's going to have to remesh. I will pause the vid and come back in a second for this one. And there we go. We can see the stones are back on. And if I zoom in, you'll see that the original stones are crisscrossing everywhere. And our ivy is going to want to grab onto those surfaces because we've only told it to follow the surface of our whatever our source mesh is. And that would be undesirable. And not only that, obviously, when you've got all these surfaces interfaces in the center here, you're also massively increasing the surface area. So you've got more polygons, more processing time, and all that. So like I said, the reason we're doing this meshing operation is to optimize the scene in general, and a bit of time spent now will benefit hugely later on. Depending on your scene, of course, if you have simple geometry, it shouldn't be a problem, and all the particles will flow across no problem. But again, we're doing volume operation and reducing the polys. Okay, so we've added the wall and the wall stones, including the masonry cement. And now we want to add the loose ground stones and the base. So let me just, I'm going to deactivate the wall just so I can work on it nice and quickly. Let's show the ruin again. Let's get rid of that flag. Okay. And save. Always save going along. That's never ever fails to be good advice. Oh, and I've just noticed, because we've got our backface culling on this display tag, I've only just noticed this, that the lathe on the bottom here is actually inverted. The normals are flipped. One other way to check that, if I turn the display tag off, there we go, and I go to a flat view. If you ever need to check this, make sure your textures are showing. And just, I tend to throw a colored material onto it. Like that. And then just hit front. And make sure it's nice and bright colored so you can see it. And you can see when it's on front mode, if I change it to back mode, that tells me that that's flipped the wrong way. So all we need to do is go into the lathe that I have here and flip the normal. And turn that off. Now, it's just something I caught with my eye there. Put that back on, put that back on. There we go. Got a nice representation of our thing to work with. Okay, so last up we need to add in this base section here, so like the ground plane and things to our mesher. So similarly to last time, we just need to drag this null into here and then it'll process. The one thing that it will do is that I have a prediction here. If anything's, because these are pushing through the bottom here, basically you're going to have to get rid of them somehow. And we're going to use this base lathe in difference mode to cut them out. So I will drag this in. I only want the ground dirt, so I want loose stones and ground dirt. So I'm going to turn the mesher off so it doesn't have to process. Drag ground dirt in, drag loose stones, put that above, nice. And then what I can do is I can actually just drag this base in straight away, drop that base down to the bottom there. I want it to be doing a difference process, which is subtract. So if I hit difference there, that's subtract mode. And let's hit the checkbox and I'll come back once it's processed. So you can see here the black lines are the OVDB mesh and it has a nice flat base. The reason that's going to be useful is that when we do polygon reduction, it likes flat surfaces. It can make very few polys out of a nice flat surface. So I think that's just better to have than wasted geometry. We might even clip, when we actually do the poly reduction, we might even select those polys and delete them out completely because they're unnecessary for the sim. All right, so we've got our several sort of meshed, volumized objects. And let me go to, so we can see the surfaces. Now we're going to combine them together. So we just need to reactivate them and let them process. but I'm going to predict a few things, and this is from experience. There are places where if the mesh doesn't meet perfectly, in fact, this is a perfect area to look at. So if I change the display mode to, say, let's go quick shading, you can see here, there's actually clean air and there's actually some missing geometry. It was somewhat deliberate, but just to demonstrate, basically, this will create a cavity here in the volume that's kind of unnecessary and will be wasted polygons. So what we'll do is I'll predict it and I'll do it straight away, is I'm going to add a filling block. So I'm going to add a block. Let's change the display mode to something a bit more. There we go. Go flat, and I'm going to turn the textures off so we can see those multicolors. Nice. And then I'm going to create this block, and I'm going to place it in here. And you can see, I don't want it to come out here, otherwise we'll end up with a flat surface in the actual geometry. Oh, it's a bit too wide at the moment, so let's just shrink down like there. You could absolutely leave this gap in here. It's not a problem, and you know, this is really for me to demonstrate to you just some tricks to optimize your meshes and things. So I'm just going to get it as wide as possible before it comes through the front there, and then shrink it a touch more back, push it in, and that should just create a nice solid block there. Now if we look in the center here, actually, let's just go down into the mesh. Sorry, getting a little bit lost with the camera there, so I'll put this into wireframe again. Go lines, there we go. And now let's add our wall back into the meshing operation and see what we get. So just gonna check wall on, let it process, and I'll come back. And you can see here we've actually got the wall included in our mesh now, and I'm going to hide the whole ruins hierarchy, so I'm going to hide that there. And this is where we're going to see the real power of this. So if I zoom into here, I could probably hide that cube, and let's just leave it in for now. Oh, I didn't actually include it, did I? Ha, never mind, let's just turn it off for now. And we can zoom in here, and you can see most of it is clipped away, and we're getting this nice combination of the meshes. But we can definitely see some kind of weird parts where there's bridging across, and we can kill that out with some extra geometry like that cube. So first off, let's add our cube back in, and we'll actually make a hierarchy of them. So I'm going to turn off our OpenVDBMesher. I'm going to show our geometry again, and I'm going to add in this cube here. I'm going to add another one all the way across. Just make sure it clips as much as possible across, but also that it doesn't come through the mesh too much either side. So let's turn that back on. I'll put it into constant shading again. That's quite a good way to see if that is, so you can see there, that's where our mesh is coming through. That's good. But the interior one is there to just clear out the inside geometry we don't need. So let's go all the way to that end. And that should be our lot. Oh, there we go. Shrink that down. Okay, that's fine if it comes through a little bit there. That's not going to be a problem. And let's let that mesh again. So we need to first include our, we'll call these culling stones or subtract stones. Oh, subtract. Cubes. There we go. Let's put that into our ruin. Make sure they're hidden because we don't want them to be visual geometry. You could always add them to the layer. You can just paint down. If you grab that, you can just paint down onto the. Oops. There's children there. There we go. So let's jump into our mesher. Let's make sure our cubes are added. So let's add them. They can go anywhere really. They can go just below the wall. Remember, they're being added in union mode. So they should, and let's change the display mode to wire. And let's let the meshing process again. Okay, and that's now added in. Let's double check and have a look at the interior of our mesh. Let's hide our ruins again. And we can see here, everything's being meshed together. Let's go inside. And there we go, we get a nice clear run. Now there are still some floating sort of island sections that we can get rid of later on. We can even smooth these out in geometry operations, which I'll show you a bit later, using sculpting tools. And there are a few weird bits here, but that's not a problem. I'm just trying to get this cavity as empty as possible so that the surface isn't letting the ivy go under and around weird places. Excellent, so that's that part done. Now all we have to do is add the window back in. Then we'll make it editable, and then we can start working on reducing polygons. So last one, let's reactivate our window, let it process, and we'll come back. Okay, and there we go. We can see our mesh has been completed. And if we zoom in, we can see inside here that we have a continuous mesh. And the volume here, you can see it's added the window in, and it doesn't have any gaps in between the mesh. So if I look inside here, you can see this includes the window. So all the window geometry is included, and that means our particles can flow nicely over the mesh. Okay, so the next step is to make this editable, and then we can do some smoothing operations, this is in preparation for the polygon reduction stuff. So let's just make this editable. Jump here, you can either hit this button here, or I think it's C by default. And once that's now a piece of geometry, we can deal with it as polygons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to polygon mode, and I'm going to smooth out a side that we don't really care about. So if you look here, we're going to be mostly viewing our model from maximum this angle. We're never going to go beyond that, or that's probably even too extreme. So I actually want to get rid of all these nooks and crannies here, because when we do our polygon reduction, the polygon reduction tries to maintain detail in those curved areas. Now our mesh at the moment, if you look at this display here, if you hit Shift V, you'll get the viewport settings, and you can go to HUD, and then you can get these total edges, polygons, selected edges, and all that stuff. And I like to have those up all the time. So we're seeing 308,042 polygons. And we can get that way down because we're going to use the polygon reduction tool. So let's smooth this out using a sculpting brush. So if we go to sculpt, if you don't have the sculpting tool set, there's always the brush tool, which shortcut is M and then C. And then that has a smooth mode. You have to be in polygons, and you can use the smooth mode here. And then it's pretty similar. I prefer to use the sculpt tools. They're a little bit more... they work in the normal object mode, so you can see it nice and clearly. So if I grab the smooth tool, you'll see, and I start brushing, you can see I can smooth that right out. Okay, and we'll just go, basically just anywhere that we're not going to be seeing. I can reduce the size, holding Control and Shift and middle mouse drag. There we go. You want to avoid smoothing over the top, otherwise that's going to be weird. Remember, we're not seeing this mesh. This is actually going to be an invisible mesh. It's just purely for the particles to flow over, and then the visual mesh will be showing. So you could call this a proxy for our actual mesh. Okay, smooth that out nicely. And you can see that that hole's been sealed up completely, and we can't see through the mesh at all there. That just stops the particles from going through there where we don't want them. Definitely smooth that ledge out. That'll create some detail. Like I said, this is all just purely to reduce the polygon count and keep it as efficient as possible. And depending on your scene, the degree of which you'll need to go to do this, and how much you want to optimize, and how much time you have on the project, all that kind of thing, will factor in how much time it's worth putting into this operation. And some scenes will be much quicker than others, depending on the source geometry and all sorts of other stuff. So the larger the scene and the more detail you need to preserve, generally it'll be more stressful or heavy on the processing. But what you could say is that if you have multiple parts in your scene, there's going to be ways that you can optimize. You could just mesh one part, like a segment of it that is a hero segment, so you could do more detail, and then a much lower res one for the rest of it. Okay, cool. We could smooth this out. I don't think we need to really. Well, we're definitely not ever going to get any particles on this side, so we're probably going to just delete this out. But to make it easy, I'm just smoothing this whole side out. Okay, there we go. Now, if I drop this, now we've done that, I'm going to drop it into a polygon reduction. And if I hold Alt whilst I drop that on, whilst I've got my mesher selected, it'll now start processing it and start reducing the polygons. So currently, obviously, it's about, it's saying it's about 900,000 polygons. I don't think it is. I think that's the vertex count, perhaps. So let's let that process. It's pre-processing currently. It doesn't actually take that long, obviously depending on how high res your mesh is. It has to return it, but that's already processed my mesh, so that's much quicker. And now if I actually show the wire mesh, so N and then B, and you can see it's a pretty nasty looking, but way lower polygon mesh. And we can actually see the number of polygons if we click on the polygon reduction object. And we can see our try count is now much smaller, 60,000. Now I think we could go a bit further on that because we don't need to worry too much. As long as we're not losing detail, I think we can reduce that further. So I'm going to go to 90. Let's try 95. And now we're down at 30,000, much, much, much smaller. I think that's looking good. So let's make that editable. And by the way, when I make these editable, I'm just pressing C. You could run current state to object just to keep things in your scene if you ever need to go back to them. I have backups of this, so I'm not too worried. So I'm going to press C. And if you do current state to object, it sometimes has to process the generator again because it'll take the state, clone it in memory, and then it'll have to do the process again. So we don't want to wait for that. So I just press C again. Okay. And now this is looking very low res compared to our original. If you compare it to our you can see this is actually in a wireframe mode and it looks solid. So if I zoom in, you can see here how much lower res that is. If I go to NG, you can see the black lines are the new lines, and they've maintained the volume and the shape, but they're much lower res, and our particles will probably enjoy the fact that they don't have to process quite so many polygons. Let me just hide that. And if you really want to go to the next extreme, we don't have to do this because we're already at a way low enough count, is you can start removing like geometry that the particles will never touch. So you can see there, that's just getting rid of the bottom plane. Do you remember I mentioned the islands earlier? I don't think we have many here, but if I select the main mesh, which I can see is connected to everything else, and I run the command, in fact, if I go to select, you can see this select command. If I go down to select connected, the shortcut is UW. That's it. That's in muscle memory for me because I use it so much. So click select connected. And now if I invert that, so I go to select, invert or UI, there is actually some polygons. There are actually some polygons selected. So if I rotate the camera around, you'll see we have some floating geometry and we don't need that. So I'm just going to hit backspace and that clears that out. And then the rest is all pretty good looking. And let's zoom out. Well, it's not really good looking. It's good for what we need it to do. And then I'm going to leave this backside of the mesh because there's not enough polys to worry about. Okay, so that's the mesh prep done. Now we're going to move on to actually applying the Ivy growth system to this. So let's, first of all, let's display our ruins again. And I think we can come out of this display mode. So I'm just going to uncheck these. I'll leave the display tag on there just in case we need it later on. And you can actually see there where the meshes are colliding, and it's got a nice bit of, sort of, you can see there the surface is going to work well for the particles to flow over. But we can hide it, and we'll call this our climbing surface. In fact, let's make sure we know it's the ruin. So ruin climbing surface. I could put low poly as well, or whatever we like. So let's turn on our Ivy growth system. In fact, if I hold Control or Command down and open that up, we can see the whole thing revealed, and we can see things are deactivated. So I'm going to activate them. There we go. And then I'm going to actually close down the ones we don't want. I want to change our climbing surface. So currently, if I display that other objects group, we've got our original climbing surface. We've got our thigmotropism, which is it's basically just an avoid object. We don't actually need that on right now. And we're going to delete out our cube and replace it with our climbing surface. Let's make it the same layer. Why not? Okay, so now we can change where the seed is coming out of. So that is currently at world 0. So let's move it up. And let's move it over to here, somewhere down here maybe. I'm going to just sit it above the ground there. And one thing with the emission geometry, I never want it to render. So I just want it to be in the scene, but I never want it to render. So I'm just going to sit it nicely on there. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do. So I'm going to deactivate our meshing just so it's nice and quick and go for the trails. And let's just give it a test run. And immediately something's happened. And I don't know if you can see, but it is not going up the wall. And that's because it's being grabbed by its nearest surface. Oh, the textures aren't on right now. So if I go to options, turn the textures back on, we can see those. A bit more clear to see the ivy growing as well. So our direction is telling it to go that way, up, but it's also attracted to the surface because it's closer to this surface than it is the wall. So I need to make sure we're nice and close to the wall. And it'll stick to the wall. There we go. Now I can see another problem. Now we've got some detail in the mesh. Why are our particles going all the way over to the right when they should be following the direction, which, if you can see here, is actually pointing up to our, up, essentially. You can see the arrow there at the bottom. It's because the particles are too large and they're bouncing off the wall and they're fighting the avoid of the mesh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the particle size so it can hug the wall more accurately. So I'm going to go into our groups, our main stem, and I'm actually going to drop all of them, apart from petiole. I might, actually petiole's at 0 at default anyway. I'm just actually going to make these 0.1, maybe even 0 them out in a second. So that's our particle radius, and you can see straight away it's moving much smoother over the mesh. And it's firing all over the place. Now we are getting some escapees, which we'll have to deal with in a second. But you can kind of get the picture of what's going on. Those ivy leaves are definitely too large in scale. I think we left them large from the last one. So, a couple of things here. Definitely getting some escapee magical vines growing up, but when I put the geometry on, you can see that it's looking pretty awesome already. I don't want them to leave that far though. So what we need to do is we need to tell the follow surface to grab them from a bit further away. I think probably 40, and the pull, I think the pull at 50 is probably good. Let's jump it to 60. Let me turn our meshes off again just to keep things nice and quick. At this point, it's not actually much slower, so I can turn them on, but I just like to work in sort of an optimized scene. And there you go, we're not getting the escapees. You can see they get this really lovely progression over the mesh. And it's filling out nicely. Now I think everything is scaled a bit strangely, so I think our main trunk here is our main stem, sorry, is way too thick. So I'm going to reduce that down. So let's just do some tweaks now whilst we're looking at it. So let's jump here, main stem. I'm going to divide it by 2. In fact, if you find yourself that you need to scale things down by a sort of similar number, let me just close this palette. What you can do is you can select all of them, and I'm going to leave the petioles because they're quite thin already. Actually, no, I will. Yeah, I'll leave them out for now. What you can do is you can select multiple objects that have the same parameter that you want to change, and you can see it's got multiple values. Now, if I entered, say, 2, it'll make them all 2. And then obviously they have their scale spline, but that's not what we want to do. We want to reduce them all down by the same ratio. What you can do is you can do some maths in this field here. So what you do is you say X, and X means the value that's there already. And then we can say either divided by, or we could do a multiple. So I'm going to multiply, and I'm going to say 0.5. So I'm going to half everything. And I do that, and you can see all of them changed, but they're all relative. So if I click on main stem, it's now 1.5, shoot 1, 0.5, shoot 2, 0.35, and so on. In fact, I could probably bring that back up again. Those two can be quite similar. There we go. And we can definitely deal with some sizes on the particles, or sorry, on the leaf geometry. So we could even actually go just to the one scaling mod. scale modifier, and you can see our upper radius is 16. I think we can divide that by 2. What this will show, I think, is that it'll be too sparse and we'll need to add more. Definitely add more in earlier on as well. And remember, the seed of the emitter has a big impact on how the branch is going to look. So if I change the seed on this now, this will do something totally different, and it might even start creating more leaves down the bottom here. So that's something to definitely note. Go back to your emitter, change your seed. You can just drag it a few up that way. And you can see that's pretty similar actually. Although it seems to be branching off to the right some more. Let's change it again. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There we go. You can see it's doing quite a different thing there. It's getting caught up. That's actually quite nice. I won't settle on this just yet because I'm making tweaks to the speed of things and that kind of stuff. You're going to have to just adapt and see, because you've created a system that will react to its geometry, to its speeds, to sort of gravity, that kind of thing, and the light. And so you need to nurse it a little bit and you make sure that it's, but you do have control over it in the sense that we can change the speeds and things like that. So that's already, I'm really liking how that is looking actually. So we'll try and maintain something like this, but obviously we can tweak that. You can see our ivies are growing out nicely. I think we still have the leaves on, oh no, we got them on straight clones. If we have them on straight clone, it means that it's going to maintain the animation. If we put it on render instances, we're going to lose the animation. It's going to get offset. You see, they all just reset to their finished state, but it'll be a bit quicker in the scene to navigate. So remember, optimize for tricks and things like that. Okay, brilliant. Let's next look at the petioles. They're actually, one thing that's happening now is that they're escaping way too far. I think they're too far away from their original branch, and that's actually affecting the density of the leaves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to restrict their speed. In fact, I'm going to restrict the speed of both of them, but I'm going to do it using 2 separate speed modifiers assigned to different groups, and then that'll just give me more control, because right now this seems to be quite fast. So if you look, it might, obviously we'd have to cache this to see this in real time, but in 2 seconds it's already made about a meter of space, so that's actually quite fast. So I could go in and I could go to these branches here, and I could reduce each of the speed values. Well, sorry, only one of them's got a speed value here, the branch speed. I could go into the groups and change the speeds, but that's going to be a bit laborious. So what I tend to do is I tend to add a speed modifier. So if I go to motion modifiers, speed, we can put this at the bottom here, and we'll call this stems, because that's going to be all the stems. Let's make sure we add the right groups. So main stem group, shoot group 1, and shoot group 2. And I'm probably not going to add any speed or control their speed. I'm going to limit their speed. So if they can't get above a certain point, and then I'm going to randomize that limit so that we get a bit more random movement, essentially, for each particle. So I'm going to clamp maximum speed. Currently, I think they're only... So if I set that to maximum of 300, and then we jump to our mapping tab, and I add a map, and I'm going to change this from, because we want to map this value, that's the particle speed maximum. So if I go back to this tab, this is the value that we're going to be changing dynamically based on the mapping parameters. And we're going to map it to a shader, and we're going to make a shader which is just a noise shader. There we go. And it just has to be random. So I tend to go for something like a blistered turbulence, throw the seed up a little bit, and then I jump the global scale. Now we'll vary this depending on how it reacts to us, but I will I'll tweak it depending on how it looks. So let's just try that now. Let's turn off our spline meshing just to make sure we can see it nice and fast. So already that's changed the shape of the sim, as I said it would. You know, depending on the speed, remember the bending is occurring at a time factor, so it bends based on the time. So if we slow the particles down, they're going to change the time that they're going to do that. So you can see now, in 2 seconds, definitely we're getting, in a couple of seconds, it's definitely less developed than it was before. And now we're going to do the same. I'm not going to use that kind of map. I'm not going to use a noisy map. I'm going to use just so I'm going to add another speed, put it down to the bottom there. I'm just adding it to the layer, and then make sure it's the petiole group or the leaf group, depending on which one you want to call it. Go back here, and now we are actually I'm going to take control of the speed. So I'm going to say 300. Oh no, that's too fast up. Well, maybe actually, let's see how that reacts. Remember, the petioles are fighting against the avoid object as well, so the wall is pushing them away, and then you've got gravity as well. So, do you know what? I'm going to give them a different trail color. So I'm going to make these ones much darker, just so they stand out nicely. There we go. And then if I go to the petiole group, let's change this to a green. Nice bright green. There we go, standing out a bit more. Or actually, against the white they stand, against the grey they stand out, but not so much the white. So let's go for darker green. There we go, that's better. So I press play, you can see essentially I'm letting them escape. Is that affecting that group? Only a certain amount. And so they're shorter and they're more bunched up, which actually helps us shape this whole thing. So if I reduce that speed to 200, I could do an age map as well if I wanted to get them to kind of not go out as far, but I don't think we need it. There we go. And you can see the petioles are much shorter, and that's actually more realistic to real life. They don't actually have much longer petioles than the leaf itself. I mean, that one's escaping somewhat further, but definitely grouping up more. And we can also increase their frequency in the original branch group. So this is all going to be personal preference. I'm going to do that. I'm going to branch from there. And I could even branch from base, which just means it'll immediately start adding more leaves. So let's press play. Remember, I'm going to change the seed, so we don't need to worry too much that it's not going up to the window just yet. And we can always add more sources in. Okay, that's looking pretty cool. And remember, as it grows, it's going to create more vines, more density. We could even slow it down, so it could... but I'm really liking how this is looking. It's kind of got a nice balance of leaves. And the longer we leave it, the more leaves we will get. I definitely didn't mean that pun. In fact, it's actually made its way... This is what I love about these organic systems, is that they actually find a route. And you can see they're actually finding their way all the way across here and up through. And that's awesome. I definitely think the coverage is a little bit low, so we might want to add more branches or just encourage it to start moving to the left a bit more at the beginning. So I'll tell you what, let's just try a couple of seeds out. So let's minimize these sections here. And this, like I said, this will all be personal preference. So I'm just going to duplicate that one, or double that one by make it twice the seed value. It's really interesting. It's obviously avoiding something here that forces it all the way back over to the right-hand side, which is really cool. If we're finding that it's disobeying too much, we can always force it to have a higher acuteness of turn on the direct modifier. And you see it's fighting it, but it's definitely going to... 15% is probably quite high here. But can you see how quickly we ended up over here? I really like that, because that's clustering quite quickly over there. And then we are getting some coming back down here. But what I do want, I think I want it to branch sooner. I definitely feel like we're not getting enough coverage on the wall at the beginning. So that could be a branching thing. We could say the branching is in much more frequent for this second shoot group. So let's say we go to 10. No, it still needs, and go to the main one, branch that one in 10. There we go. That's going to be much denser now, because we've added double the, essentially it's branching twice as frequently. And that's looking pretty cool, I have to say. We've got an escapee again. So that's probably the branching being pushed away again. Definitely can use our follow surface. The avoid is probably larger than that. Yeah, so the avoid is actually pushing it more. Although that is only the, to be fair, that is it should only be the petioles. Oh no, that's the thigmotropism. No, that's actually fine, because that's limited to the petiole group. This is not a petiole group, this particular trail. It's a shoot 2 group. So we need to just make sure that follow surface is strong. The distance is good. We could also add more subsurface steps as well. That can also help make a modifier more. It's basically sampling the scene more frequently. But I think that looks really awesome. So what's happening now, because I've added this higher distance, when they do leave, they immediately start thinking, oh, I'm away from the surface, I need to go back to it. Which in reality is what happens. These don't grow far out from their surfaces. But I quite like how it's leaving somewhat. All right, so I think we're getting somewhere here, and we're getting close to something that I like to see. What I might say is that we don't actually need them on the back side of this wall and maybe some of this. So what we could do is in the thigmotropism, or the avoid, if we're being less scientific about it, I can put this cube in here. I can just drag it out the back here. As long as the wall's fairly flat, I guess. That we'll find out in a second. I think it is. Yeah. What we could say is just have it slightly intersect, and maybe not go up too high, because I don't want it to completely stop them from going up and behind and wrapping around and stuff. So that now, if we hide that one as well, make sure our void, I should actually name this one thigmotropism. I hope the spelling is right on that one. Now if we press play, now depending on the distance, that might be pushing it from behind the wall, so I might want to reduce that down to something like 2040. Remember, all these will interact, all these modifiers will interact to create your shaping. And interestingly, we're actually getting a cluster here where they're getting pushed back by that. You can see, where is it? Let's show it. I think we're too deep into the wall there, so if we just stick it like there, it'll just give them a nice nudge back towards the other side of the wall. Awesome. So I think this is getting pretty much close to ready to render it. And we're just going to do a nice simple render where we'll follow it up the wall. And we might add another one the other side. In fact, we could do that now. Let's just add another source just to show you how easy that is. So in the emission geometry, we just duplicate our seed. We can call it O2, of course. I just move it over here, drop it down a little bit so it's hidden, press play. And you can see it's getting dragged down into the center there, and we're getting loads of coverage on the sill there. That's nice. Yeah, I really like that. And remember, this is all dependent on your source geometry, the strength of the follow surface, all those balances to be made. And you can tweak it depending on what kind of plant you've got as well. And the cool thing is, if we go into the mesh here, we shouldn't see too much intersection. Not that it matters too much. Oh, I've got the ruin showing. So if I go here and I display our collider, I'm looking for our climbing surface. I've actually got that hidden there. There we go. We can see some of these pushing through, but that's not a problem. Well, depending on your scene, it's not going to be a problem, but you can see they're pushed away by the wall surface. Awesome. So that is looking really cool. And I think we're going to cache that, and also perhaps we decide whether we have the leaves become actual geometry, or the actual animated ones, or whether we have them just at the beginning they kind of unfurl and things like that. The consideration there is that the RAM usage and the memory can be quite high if you use just straight cloning, but you do get that lovely unfurling. So if I change it back to straight cloning, and what that means is it literally is just taking another piece of geometry and duplicating it onto the particle. And then you get this lovely, you get the unfurling going on. I think we might have to keep that in. Oh, definitely missing our spline meshes there. Lovely. And this should fill out quite nicely. We might need to scale down those branches a bit more, actually. You can definitely see the processing's harder now for it, but it's still viewable. So if I pause here, and of course you could switch between, whilst you're viewing this in the viewport, you could switch between create render instances and the geometry, and it'll swap them out and might speed it up a little bit. Because we've got double the number of branches systems here, we're definitely getting this duplication and a bit more of a pressure on the speed, but I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. And what we should do next is we should cache that out to disk, or you could cache it to memory, but that's going to be a bit heavy, and I think disk is much more versatile, because then if you render over a network via team render or things like that, you'll benefit from that hugely. So I'm going to cache this. Let's go to as I showed you earlier, or you might have seen before, is you can find X-Particles objects anywhere. I like to use Commander, so I'm going to go Commander with my command key as Shift-C by default, and then I'm going to do XP cache, so XPC, and then I'm just going to drop a cache into our scene. Now, I'm not going to put it into our system object. I like to, depending on how complex the scene is, I like to have access to my cache object. So let's take a look at everything. Let's make our decision on the. First off, I'm going to cache it with straight cloning, and then if there's any problems later on, we can jump back to render instances. Okay, I'm going to cache that. We'll come back. We'll check the scene, the final checks of the scene, and then we'll look at our rendering. All right. And you can see I've got my default cache location set up here. We've got it compressing, and then I'm going to hit build cache. Okay, so that's now cached down to disk, and we have a hefty 20 gig disk space used. That's definitely why we use cache down to hard disk rather than into your memory. If you're having memory problems with this, if it's not loading or anything like that, then I think we have to go back to having render instances for our particles here, but also perhaps reducing the subdivisions on the trails, that kind of stuff, and even reducing the particle count down. You know, it's all about keeping it modular, keeping the memory down. Now this is obviously going to be a heavy scene because we've got way more items in the scene. If I press Control I again, Command I, we'll get some information on our scene. And the scene is now 134 meg if you save it to disk. Polys, points. So if we look at the polys, we've got the original sort of 1.3 million, which is mostly the ruins, and then a few other bits. But if you look at with the duplication and the instancing, we now have 2.5 million. So it's much more. And we've gone from 236 objects, or it was a bit more than that actually, to 12,767. Most of those will be those individual leaf parts. So obviously we've increased the what's in the scene so much that it's going to be a bit choppier, but we can still rotate around, and we will get a better idea of how it's going to play back. That is, if we turn the leaves off. You can see that's looking really nice. So we can see that moving up there and growing those leaves off. If we turn the leaves off themselves, that's probably going to give us the biggest boost. So if I turn those leaves off, still cached, but it'll allow us to play back almost in real time. You can see as it gets up, it's slowing down here. You can see my FPS is dropping. So maybe we drop the geometry out and we only have the trails. That will probably be our most efficient mode. So if I do that, and as always, you should always render a hardware render instead. So that now we're getting pretty real time here. And you can see we're getting this incredible density over here. That's going to be really cool when it's got the leaves on. But you can see how quickly it fills up. And I'm quite happy with how it's crawling over everything. And we haven't got too many escapees. And the window's getting almost full coverage there. So brilliant. And to limit this, we could even have we could take the branch modifiers, for instance, and have them limited to much less than their 600 units and their 400 units here. Because obviously now we've increased the number of them that spawn. Sorry, I keep highlighting that by accident. It's going to exponentially increase the number of items in the scene. However, I kind of like that density. It's looking pretty good. Let's throw on our leaves again. Give it a second because it's going to have to load, basically from the disk, it's going to have to load a compressed cache, uncompress it, and display it to us. So give it a second, and then I'll turn on the spline meshes as well, actually. So let's do that. And my processor's currently going, and the RAM's increasing. And eventually we will see it. There we go. So I didn't have to pause the video, luckily. And that is looking pretty dense and awesome. So I think that's going to render really nicely because we've got so much density to our sim there. You're going to see the scene definitely a bit more, definitely heavier, but I think worth it. So for now, I'll turn that off just so I can move around my scene. If I as soon as I turn the leaves off, watch how basically once that's unloaded out of the memory, I'll be able to spin around this scene no problem. So I think the compromise is probably best to have. Look at how dense that is. That looks awesome. Yeah, I mean the density there is perhaps even too much, but I quite like the idea of having it up that high. So I'm going to leave it as is, and that's our cache. Next up, we're gonna move on to rendering. We'll throw some cameras around and check out some cycles materials.